So the mic is working and volume is better. You don't see Darth Vader effect. Okay, here, but they can, yeah. Okay. Cool. Okay, so the next topic is just enough administration, or GIA, and we will talk about how to minimize risk of Windows administration, or what is the new way of delegating administration in a Windows environment. In modern Windows environment, because GIA is part of PowerShell 5, and we will talk about all the capabilities of GIA and what's new there. So I will not spend a lot of time introducing myself because I did that during the first session. Just to repeat that, my name is Alexandar Nikolic, and I'm a trainer and MVP connected with the PowerShell on so many different levels, but PowerShell magazine is one of those ones that are most visible one. So let's start first with the statement that the admins are an attack surface, right? So the bad guys, external and internal, are after those admin credentials and other credentials of power users, right? So why I'm saying internal guys, right? Because usually when you think about bad guys, you think about bad guys outside of your company, but also in your company, you can have a bad guys, right? And you can actually think about all those users that have a local admin privileges as actually bad guys, because they are actually the owners of their own machine. And if you connect to your admin credentials to those machines, those guys can easily get your credentials. So if they have some bad intentions, it's very easy for them to do that. They only need one tool. They need a tool called Mimikatz. And once when you're connected with your admin credentials to their machines, your credentials are going into memory. They can fetch that from a memory, and from that point, they can be you, right? It's really scary. The first time you run Mimikatz and you see all your passwords, you're just like, oh man, this is not good, right? So how many of you are familiar with the Mimikatz tool, right? So you know what I'm talking about, right? How many of you are familiar with GIA? Okay, just a few, but that's good. So what do we want? No. So we want people to do their job, but we don't want to give them admin privileges to do their job. And that's something that you probably struggle in your environment as well, right? Every time when someone needs to do something that asks for those privileges, the management will probably tell you, just give them admin rights, right? No. They need to do that job, right? And as sysadmin, you don't want that, right? You don't want those local admins running around your running around your environment. So do we have someone here that has still users as a local admins or their own stations? Yeah. You're the honest guys, right? I know there are some other guys here that are just not that honest. But we always have that. We know that there are certain environments with that. And GIA is here to help you, because GIA can enable non-admin users to perform admin tasks without being admins. Right? So that's the power of GIA. So if a machine got cracked, it wouldn't leak the high-value credits. That's also one of the things. But not if. It's actually when machine is cracked. Because we can see the big change is how Microsoft and some other vendors are thinking about security now. They're assuming a breach. They're assuming that the bad guys are already there. So it's not like if that happens. No. It already happened probably. You're just not aware of that. Right? And you still need to operate in an environment when the bad guys are already there. Right? So it's not that easy as before, when you will put a wall around you and you think like, oh, I'm safe, right? Now you need to think that they're already there. So we also want to enable people to do only the things that they actually need to do for their tasks. not something more than that. And we want to log all those actions. And Microsoft did an amazingly great job of providing better logging in PowerShell 5. So if you're still thinking about should I upgrade to PowerShell 5, if you are concerned about security, and we all should be concerned about security, the logging is the reason number one to go with PowerShell 5. Because with PowerShell 5 you can actually get all those things in the logs, and then we have a kind of a new problem, but that's a better problem. From all those things there, we need to find the valuable information. But that's much better than before. We couldn't get actually any logs, or we couldn't get a lot of logs, and then we will be aware that there is something bad happening, but there are no trails of that in our environment. So now with PowerShell 5 it's much better, and with GIA it's even more better, more controlled, and you will see that a little bit later during demos. So the main thing is here reducing the risk, right? Minimizing that risk. So we can incrementally reduce how the admin credentials and admins are exposed. So we can first reduce the number of people with admin privileges, right? There are certain environments that have a number of domain admins, and sometimes you will realize that a lot of those guys are actually not needed as domain admins at all. Or you will give them those rights for certain tasks that they need to perform in a couple of hours, and then you will forget about it, right? And then later when you get the auditor, then you will have a problem, right? Because they will realize that you have 10 domain admins in your environment, and your environment is not that big, right? And you actually don't have guys that are working on that, but they just have those privileges. We need to reduce the impact of admin privileges as well, and reduce what can be done with those admin privileges. And again, log. That's like a new mantra, right? Try to log as much as possible. And with, for example, OMS, Operation Management Suite, that log analytics based in Azure, it's just amazing how fast you can get valuable information there. If you have a good queries, it's just fantastic. So do we have a solution for all these things? We have a solution. It's based on PowerShell remoting security features. And if you think about it, it's not actually something very new. Do we have Exchange admins in a row? A few. So those guys are aware that the way how they work with Exchange has great support with role access capabilities, role-based access, role-based access control system, so that they know that when they as admins connect to Exchange, they get, I don't know how many, but let's say hundreds of commandlets exposed for them to administer Exchange. When a standard user connects to Exchange to manage his own mailbox, that guy already get access to, let's say, 15 commandlets, okay? Because only those 15 are needed for that job. If he wants to update information about a phone or change address or a team or something like that, that should not be a work for admin. So that standard guy can use that. But Exchange Online and Exchange will expose just the needed commandlets to that guy. So what we get with the GIA is based on session configurations. On the implementation with Exchange is based on IIS and WinRM extension for IIS. Here we have implementation with the WinRM service. So let's talk about session configuration as one of the things that it's crucial to understand how GIA actually works. So what happens when you connect to remote computer using PowerShell remoting? You might have remembered that in a previous session, a few times when we used PowerShell remoting to connect to Nano, we connected to something called Microsoft.PowerShell. And I mentioned that with Microsoft.PowerShell session configuration, we get access to a full PowerShell if we are members of the local administrators group. So the session configuration is also called remoting endpoint. So when you connect to a remote machine, you connect to that session configuration, you need to know the name. Then you have ACL assigned to it, which means that it will give you information like who is actually able to access that endpoint. By default, the local administrators can do that, and also users of remote management users group. That group was added, I think, with Server 2012. I'm not sure, but I think I have something on one of the future slides. Then for session configuration, you can also have a startup scripts, and that's something that runs at the moment when you connect to that session configuration. And before they created GIA, startup scripts were the only way actually to properly constrain your session configuration, because what I didn't mention is that you can also create a custom session configuration. Microsoft.PowerShell and some others are default ones, but you can create your own and constrain it properly. And then later they introduced run as credentials. We will go through the history of how those things change from PowerShell 1 to PowerShell 5. But with run as credentials, you can actually specify credentials that will run those commands once when you connect to it. And they will change the context of it. So you will connect as a non-admin, but then you can run it with some user who has admin rights or just higher rights, higher privileges than you, even if you are just connected to it. And it will be very transparent to you. You will see that later. So if you want to work with the session configurations, we have a number of commands for working with that, and they all have a same string in the name, PS session configuration. So if you run get command star PS session configuration star, you will get all those commandlets there that you can use when you want to work with session configuration. So let me demo to you how we work with the default session configuration and what are some of the steps that are kind of useful for working and managing session configurations. So again, to mention here what I have as an environment, I have in Azure a test domain with a domain controller and a number of member servers, and I will use one of those member servers, server 1, as my admin station. Okay. So in the first demo, I will create a new session targeting server 2. Now I'm on server 1. So when I create that session, remoting is enabled on server 2. If we look at the session object in admin session variable, you can see here that we have a property called configuration name. And the value is Microsoft.PowerShell. That's the default one. Okay. If you have rights to connect to it, then you will get exposure to a full PowerShell. Full PowerShell language, all commandlets, all functions, everything that is available there. If you were locally on server 2, will be available to you here in a remote session. There is an automatic variable called a PS session configuration name that contains actually the name of that default session, because you can ask like how PowerShell knows to connect to Microsoft.PowerShell. And you can see that the value in PS session configuration name is this URL. You can use the URL, you can use just the Microsoft.PowerShell, or for example, if you want to connect to some other built-in, okay, this is cool. I forgot to, yep. That usually doesn't happen, but it happened this time. What's wrong with this? I have a problem here to connect. Jakob? Yep. Where? Okay. You just saved me. That's good. Okay. Everything works now. So to get the list of the built-in session configurations, you can run get PS session configuration, and you can see that those 4 are built-in session configurations on a server. We have Microsoft.PowerShell. We have Microsoft.PowerShell 32 that exposes a 32-bit PowerShell if you have 64-bit operating system. Then we have Microsoft.PowerShell.Workflow for working with PowerShell workflows. And we have internal Microsoft Windows Server Manager workflows that Microsoft is using for remotely connecting to machines with the Server Manager. But that one is not exposed to you, so you should not try to use it. So if I want to connect by default without specifying configuration name with new PS session, for example, you can specify PS session configuration name equals Microsoft PowerShell 32, and then you will connect to 32-bit PowerShell on remote machine. So once when you create your own, if you want to specify that new session configuration for your users so that they don't need to specify configuration name every time when they create session, you can change the value of that variable. How can we get registered PS session configurations on remote machines? The easy way would be to use computer name with get PS session configuration. Unfortunately, that parameter is not supported. The first time I asked about it, I got the information. The reason for it is a security, which really is still a puzzle for me because there are other ways to get it. So I don't see how is that kind of a security problem. But if I look at the PS session configuration syntax, you see that we don't have computer name there. But fortunately, there are other ways to get it. One of the ways is to use invoke command, connect to a remote machine, and then run get PS session there. So if I do that, I will get again a list of session configurations that exist on my server too. As you can see, I have some built-in there, but I think that I have some others that I've created for demo purposes. I have here one called demo IT dev. I have one called demo full language that I will use later during my demos. Another cool way to connect to your remote WinRM service and check for PS session configurations there is to use connect WSMan. Connect WSMan commandlet connects you to that WinRM service on remote machine, expose all the settings there, so you can get information or you can change information on a service as well. So here we will just do the get part. We will not change anything. So I will connect to a WinRM service on server 2. Go into WSMan provider, which is exposing WinRM service to us as a PS drive. And now I can browse it. So as you can see, now on my machine, server 1, I have access to a WinRM settings on localhost and server 2. So here I will go and look at the plugins. So now we have a third tier for the same thing. So a session configuration is also called remoting endpoint. But when we talk about WinRM, all session configurations are plugins. The interesting here is that all WinRM plugins are not session configurations. So there are certain plugins in WinRM that are not actually connected to a session configuration. They're not connected to PowerShell remoting. So if you see here, the last two, SEL plugin and WMI provider plugins, they are WinRM plugins, but they are not session configurations. Okay, so all session configurations are WinRM plugins, but not all WinRM plugins are session configurations. So you can see here that I have a list of those, and there is another one that I didn't mention, event forwarding plugin. That's also just a plugin, not a session configuration. So that's the second way to get it. And then the third one is also with WSMan commandlet. People usually don't use them so much, which is kind of a shame because they give you great access to WinRM. And you just need to learn a little bit more about them, but they're really powerful. So you can use get WSMan instance to enumerate all the plugins, and I'm here selecting just the names for you. So you have like 3 different ways to get information about what's available for connection on remote machine. If you get the information, that still doesn't mean that you can connect. Okay, so if the ACL is different and you don't have access to that session configuration, you are still out of luck. So just the way that you can get it, it's not enough. Let's look at all the properties of the default Microsoft.PowerShell session creation. So you can see here there's a lot of properties, and one of the interesting one is the security, the script of SDDL, which is really, if you look at it, it's not for humans, right? When you look at this and it's like, really, who has access now, right? I want to mention that because Microsoft created a new commandlet called convert from SDDL string for us, so we can now get something that it's really for humans, right? So you can read it here when you look at the DACL here, that interactive is access allowed, built-in administrators, remote management users, as I mentioned before. So this is default access for default session configuration called Microsoft.PowerShell. So it's much better and easier to work with this convert from SDDL. So now that we talk about default and built-in session configuration, let's talk about constrained endpoints. The job of constrained endpoints is to reduce what can be done via PowerShell remoting. So when we create constrained endpoints, we can expose just a subset of commandlets and functions to our connected users. We can also control who can connect, changing ACL for constrained endpoint, and we can also elevate those privileges if we use run as credentials. So I'm giving you all this because that's all part of that GIA story. So you need to understand how things evolve, because it's not that easy. GIA is pretty complex feature. It has a lot of moving parts there. There is a lot of things to understand. And the interesting thing here is that we had constrained endpoints since PowerShell 2. They created that feature with the first version of PowerShell remoting, but it was kind of a little bit hard to work with it. With GIA, it's much easier. That's the main thing, and much more kind of a controllable with the logging and all that stuff. So to give you that history thing here, like in PowerShell 2, we got those constrained endpoints, and they were based on a startup script. So it was your job actually to write a PowerShell script as a startup script and constrain properly that endpoint, removing certain functionalities of PowerShell and exposing the things that you really wanted. So it was all up to you. It was not easy. Then in PowerShell 3, they created new PS session configuration file. And the job of that commandlet was actually to create the whole process much easier for you. I think one of the triggers was my session in 2011 at the first PowerShell Deep Dive conference, when I talk about constrained endpoints and kind of showed them all the code, and then team realized like this is a little bit too hard for a common admin to use. So if we want a greater adoption of constrained endpoints, we need to make it easier. The new PS session configuration file was a good step into that direction, but it actually still didn't work very well for complex scenarios. So it was, if you ask me, kind of a good for simple things, great for demos, but they needed to kind of improve it. And they also introduced run as credentials, so it was possible to run those credentials with higher privileges than the privileges that the connected users has. So they also added remote management user group. That group didn't exist before, and that group was added so that if you want to add someone new, you don't need to do any other changes, but just add that user to that group, and from that moment, that user will be able to access endpoint. Then in PowerShell 4, they actually didn't do anything with constrained endpoints. They focused more on desired state configuration. There were not big changes in constraining endpoints and all that remoting stack so much. But then in PowerShell 5, we got just enough administration. And during the beta days of it, they actually talk about GIA as the new desired state configuration thing, and they expose GIA through desired state configuration resources. But then they realized it would be better if they actually built in all the capabilities with a PowerShell, so that it's not actually dependent on DSC at all, but they will use DSC for deployment part. In PowerShell 5.1, they improved GIA even more, and we are waiting for PowerShell 5.1 that will run on a down-level operating system. I don't know if you're aware, they just, I think, last week announced that we will get it in January. So it will run on down-level systems, and then we can use GIA on those systems as well, and that will kind of work nicely. So in this demo, I will just show you how we work with constrained endpoints before. I will not go deeply there because we have now a better way to work with those, but I just want to show you how hard it was actually in the early days of constrained endpoints. So let's create a constrained endpoint with a startup script. So what I want to do here is I want to do everything remotely. So as you have seen, I will work with this server too without interactively logging to that machine. I don't want to perform anything locally. I want to show you how it was possible to work remotely with the remoting endpoints and change them and reconfigure them, and everything was supported from a local site, from my own machine. So here I will create a admin session, as I say. So I'm connected now as a member of the local administrators group to my server 2. The prompt has changed, as you can see. And I will now use the new capability of psedit function to edit a script that exists on remote machine. I have a startup script there created. And as you can see here, the main functionality is based on a property for command info object that can be set to private or public. Because the point here that is that we want to hide all those things that we don't want people to get exposure to, and then we will create a public content for our endpoint. So here in the first part, I'm setting visibility to private for commands, and then for variables, then I'm clearing access to all applications and scripts. And then I'm getting to that crucial part of this when I create initial session state and set it to remote server. What it does is that it actually exposes only, now in PowerShell 5.8, before it was 7, required proxy commands. For a great experience when you work with the remoting, even with constrained endpoints, interactively, or with implicit remoting, or just with a fan-in with invoke command. There are certain commandlets that needs to be exposed as a functions in that, and this line of code will help you to that, and it will just generate those required commandlets for you. And GIA is not any different. GIA will do that as well. It will create those required commandlets for you, and then you will add the public content to that. And then I will not go into code here. So we have those proxy functions defined and stuff, and then we finally get to a public content here. So the first 38 lines you can use actually as some kind of a template, and you can use that in every startup script. And then after that, you will go to the public content and expose the actual functions to your users. What I have here, I have one module with a couple of functions, and I'm exposing the functions from that module in that endpoint. I also set a language mode to no language. So we have a certain language modes when we work with PowerShell. We have Default one, we restricted, constrained, and a null language. When we talk about properly constrained endpoints, we always need to talk about null language. We'll show you also how can you easily exploit an endpoint when someone set it to a full language. So they will think that everything is kind of a constrained properly. They exposed only 10 commands, but the language mode is set to full, and you can easily get around that and get exposure to everything. So this is how we did that before. So you needed like a 46 line or 50 lines of code to work around that, but they thought like, okay, it could be better with the GIA and stuff. So still I want to show you how to work with this. So I will exit this session. I will need a helper function for working with the SDDL, and I have it on a local machine but not on a remote machine. So inside of this session I will use a file path in combination with invoke command to send that script for execution there, and now you can see that I have that command exposed in that session, inside of that session, so that I can use. And now I create here just a script block that I will run later, but it's a little bit longer, so I put it outside of command, and you can see that it's registering that session configuration, it's registering that endpoint. You give it a name, you point to a startup script, it's on a local, it's on that remote machine. You define SDDL because I don't want to use GUI for it, I want to automate that fully. I define run as credentials so that it runs as a local admin on server 2. So I will connect as someone who doesn't have local admin rights, but everything that will be executed in the context of the local admin. It's also the power of run as credentials, and I will set no service restart, because if I do that immediately, then I will get some input-output errors. So now I'm running this script. To register, I need to pass credentials for a local admin on server 2. I get this warning that if you do and set run as credentials, you need to be careful. For example, if you sign run as credential as a domain admin, you need to treat that remote machine as a domain controller, because everything will be executed in the context of domain admin. Here I'm using local admin, so if that machine is in the hands of a malicious user, he's already owner of that machine. He already has access to everything. So I'm not exposing more than that, right? But if you go with the account that has access over network, you need to be careful, right? You need to treat that machine differently because you're exposing that machine to us. And then I need to restart Avina RAM, and because I'm doing that inside running my remote command, this is accepted and accepted error as well, because I actually restarted Avina RAM service at the same time I was connected to it. So this is expected problem. Now I will create a non-admin credential. First I needed credentials. Then I will create to computer name to that specific new constraint endpoint called demo PowerShell user group Denmark using non-admin credentials. I added this. This is not mandatory, but I added this because I wanted to show you what is exposed, but you can get that later when you create a session to that endpoint on a remote machine and you run get command. So if I run get command, you will see here that I have a bunch of those exposed from my own module, and I have 8 of those that are exposed by default to have to support a great experience with different remoting scenarios. Exit pair session, get command, format data, get help, measure object, out default, and select object. Those are the ones that I have here. So if I want to run any of those, let me see this one because it's kind of quick. So it's running now on that remote machine. It gives me information about the last boot up time. I can get some system info. See, it's executed on server 2. So of all PowerShell, this non-admin user has access only to kind of a 10 of them or a couple of them more. But I don't need to take care about rights for those commandlets or those functions. I don't need to change anything depending, like if he wants to look at the services, maybe services can run as a standard user, but if I want to give them access to processes, that will not work. Or if he needs to access to an event log viewer, that will not work, right? So I'm running that as a local admin user and everything will just run. But that's completely transparent to that guy who is connected. He's not even aware that he's now local admin every time when he executes these commands. You get both information, who is connected and who is actually executing. And it's even better in Gia, we will see that. So let's exit this session and let me show you quickly that if we have a session configuration with a full language, that's not constrained. It's easily exploitable. So I will create now another session with non-admin user, but this time I will connect to demo full language session that I created for you. And if I create now into session and look at the get command output, you can see that the only things that I can use now are this couple of commands, nothing more than that. If I try to run get date, it's not working because it's not exposed. But because it's a full language, I can use a script block. Script block is dangerous. So I can execute everything in a script block. If I call call operator and put a get date in a script block, voila, it works. So now I have it. Can I check shares? Sure I can. There are shares. Just to prove you that it's a full language. How many of commands I have if I'm not in a script block? 14. How many I have if I execute inside of a script block? Almost 2,000. Okay? So full language is not constrained endpoint. Be aware of that because you can see some strange examples around the internet when people will kind of try to prove that we are constraining everything. You see only 10 commands and people cannot do anything else. Then they forget and leave the full language there. And as you can see, you have full access to everything. Okay. Script block is the dangerous beast. So let's talk now about just enough administration and all those improvements that we got with that new PowerShell security feature that enables us to work with session configurations, constrained session configuration much easier. So first, let's talk about availability, when you can use it. You can use it on Windows Server 2016, 2012 R2, 2012, 2008 R2, if it has WMF 5 installed. On a client, you can use it on Windows 10 and Windows 8.1, 8, and even 7 with WMF 5 installed. Support for virtual accounts, and we will talk more about virtual accounts, but think about them as those run as accounts. For now, in session configuration is currently not available on Windows Server 2008 R2 and Windows 7 with PowerShell 5 or WMF 5. They fixed that in PowerShell 5.1, so we can use virtual accounts with server 2008 R2, but it's still not supported on Windows 7. And virtual accounts are kind of, for me, a heart of all the system here because they will give you that local admin rights on machines or even domain admin rights on a domain controller without exposing all the domain to you. So what are the main GIA concepts and components? We talk about role capability files, about endpoint and identity. So role capabilities are well-defined set of commands that you want to support for a specific role. So here you see that we are moving to that RBAC model for PowerShell remoting, but when it's based on WinRM service, not IIS as we had with the Exchange. Then we have endpoint. We talk about endpoint a couple of times. So it's a management connection point for users that are authorized to access, and they are then provided with appropriate role capabilities. So the point here, when you start working with GIA, you first need to think, before you start executing PowerShell commands, you need to think about design. You need to actually think about the task that you want to execute. You need to think about those roles. So you might have a help desk. You have help desk engineers. They need to perform certain tasks. They need to unlock account. They need to reset the password. You need to find out what are those tasks. That you need to combine them in a module and then expose that to that role of a help desk engineer. Some other user account can be a part of a different roles. It can be part of a multiple roles as well. And depending on those roles and depending on connections to a different service, he can get a different rights and access to a different commands on a different servers. And then we have that identity. It's a privileged alternate identity used to evoke commands. That's that virtual account that I mentioned a few times. And you will see that in a demo how it actually works and how you set all those things and what's the role of all those components in working with GIA. Once when you have it, and it works nicely on one machine, but the actual goal here is to have a multi-machine deployment of endpoints and maintenance of it. So here on a high level, you can think about these steps. You need to copy your modules, because the best way to deal with this is to organize everything that you want to expose inside of your GIA endpoints in the modules. Okay? You will copy your modules together with role capabilities to each node that you want to participate there. Then you will copy your session configuration files to each node, run a register PS session configuration file with that session configuration on all those nodes, and then you would like to keep a copy of all those files somewhere securely, okay, so that you can later reuse them, or if something bad happens, you want to kind of have a control and compare them to see if someone changed something there. Microsoft is also working on DSC resource so that they can use the desired state configuration to support deployment to multiple machines. And that DSC resource, DSC module is called Just Enough Administration. It's available on GitHub. I think the address is github.com/PowerShell/GIA. And you have access for that DSC module there, and you can then use DSC actually to deploy that GIA endpoint to multiple machines. So now we'll talk about demo to see all the steps that are needed to configure GIA endpoint and then to test GIA endpoint. So again, here I will work first we work with server 2. Now we are changing, switching gears here, and we will work with the domain controller. So what I want to create here, I want to show you that it's possible to create a secure GIA endpoint on domain controller that will expose just a couple of functions to a non-admin user or the user who is a member of a help desk, for example. So here in demo, I will show you access and enable a user, but it's better to think about groups. So you will actually use groups to give them access to your GIA endpoint. If you want to enable a certain user, you will just add that user to a group, and he will immediately get access to a GIA endpoint. So let me first create a connection to my domain controller. But I need to leave my constraint endpoint on server 2 first. So here. So my demo user here is actually domain admin here. So I'm configuring GIA endpoint as a domain admin on domain controller. But later I will change hats and I will be a non-admin user who will access that endpoint. So for configuration, I need to have rights to actually do something, but let me see what's the problem. I probably mistyped. Yes, I know, because I have a different password for that guy. So now you can see that I'm connected to that default Microsoft.PowerShell as a domain admin. I will create interactive session to domain controller. The prompt will change to domain controller. I will need some variables. The one is pointing to a module path. In PowerShell 5, we have a new path for modules. You might be aware that the environment variable PS module path contains the paths to modules that will be automatically discovered by PowerShell for module auto loading feature. We have 3 paths. Let me show you this, because you might ask yourself like why you are using that path and not something else. So those are the 3 default paths for modules. One is for user-defined modules, one is for system modules coming from PowerShell team and other Microsoft product groups. That's the one in Windows System 32. And then we have program files, Windows PowerShell modules for everything else. Right? For those that are, if you put modules there, they will be exposed to all users on your machine, right? Not just you. If you put it to users and then demo user or the local user, current user, it will be exposed only to that guy. So here I'm creating a path for GIA AD module. You will see what's there later. That's the name of a module. And then you will create a new path. I will not do all those things because I already prepared them to make a demo running a little bit faster. So you will create a folder for your module. Then you will create a module manifest to support your module. And then you will create a blank script module and put your functions there. So let's look like what I'm exposing. And for I only have one function here because there are different ways to expose certain functions. I will show you some of them. Here I'm using a module. I have just one function, but you can add as much as you want here. So this reset user password function will be exposed at the end of a creation of a GIA endpoint. And then you need to create role capabilities folder. So PowerShell expects that folder to be named role capabilities. It needs to be a subfolder of your module folder that you want to use. So you will create role capabilities subfolder. Then you will create a blank role capability file there. You have a commandlet for that. This is a new one, new PS role capability file. And it needs to have extension PSRC, PowerShell remote capability. So in my file, what I have is you actually define those capabilities here. It's nothing else but just a hash table inside of a textual file. So here you have some properties, some key value pairs like a GUID and author, company, copyright, and those things. And then you need to define visible commandlets and visible functions. So this can be tricky. You need to know if your PowerShell command is actually commandlet or a function. If you make a mistake here, it will not work for you. So try to run get command against those things that you want to expose to check if they are functions or commandlets, especially if you want to expose some of those commandlets and functions created by Microsoft. Because sometimes they will be functions. You will think that they are commandlets, but they are not. Especially those that are based on SIM. They are usually functions, they are not binary commandlets. Right? So be aware of that. You first need to check, otherwise it will not work. So what I want to expose here, I want to expose unlock AD account from Active Directory module. I want to expose my own reset user password that it's part of my module that you have just seen. And then I will also expose get user info. That get user info is defined actually directly in this file. So later I have a way to define definitions, define the functions for some simple functions. You will not put here a code for something that's really long, okay? But if you have something simple like this one, that you will just create a hash table with the name for your function and a script block for the content of that function. In this case, I'm using a PS sender info, which is a variable that will give you information about connected user and the users that are actually executing commands in your endpoint. So I have three ways, as you have seen here. One function is coming from a module. One function will be exposed directly from Active Directory module because I'm working with the domain controller. Active Directory module is present on the domain controller. And then I have one function that is defined directly in this role capability file. You can expose and define the variables, environmental variables, and some other things. I'm keeping things simple here, so I will just work with those three additional functions next to those required ones. Okay. So once when you have that, I need one more path for GIA configuration. You will create that path. Then you will use finally new PS session configuration file to create PSSC file, which is PowerShell session configuration file. If you don't specify parameter -full, you will get just the basic skeleton for you. But if you want to see all the key value pairs that are available, specify -full. Then you will get everything that is there. Kind of need to investigate it. So let me show you how my session configuration file looks like. It's again a familiar format. It's a hash table inside of a textual file. Schema version 2. Why? Because they did some changes, added some new properties here. The first schema worked before with the PowerShell 2, 3, and 4. So for this one, they needed to change a schema. So schema is now 2. You have a GUID, author. You provide a nice description here. Session type, restricted remote server. That's the one responsible for exposing those required commandlets, setting language mode to no language, and setting execution policy to remote signed. Okay, so all those things are practically defined with a session type. I want also transcript for everything that is executed inside of this endpoint once when someone is connected to it. So I'm defining a transcript directory here, and here I have finally run as virtual account, and I'm setting that to true. Okay, by default it's false. I'm setting that to true. That will be that virtual account with the local admin rights on the normal machine, but if I'm working with the domain controller, it will be actually with the domain admin's rights. And that account exists only during a life of endpoint. So when one endpoint connection, when one is connected to it, then that virtual account exists. Once when you are disconnected and you kill that session, that account doesn't exist anymore. That account is responsible for executing all commands in that endpoint. You define also initial scripts. You can define here as well, and then you define role definitions. So here I enable a test non-admin user and assign the role capabilities to AD help desk. That's the role capabilities that I defined in that role capability file. So this is how they make connection to it, thanks to that name. Once when you have that, you can finally run register PS session configuration, give it a name, and then point to a PowerShell session configuration file that actually does all that work for you, combining the roles that can be assigned to a user or a group, and then you will get a session configuration created. So I can now leave this and I will show you how we can test it. So I will connect as a non-admin domain user. I will target my domain controller, connect to demo.ad-helpdesk session configuration, pass the credentials of non-domain user. If everything runs as expected, I can get the non-admin session number 3 on domain controller. It needs a little bit more time because it actually imports the AD module, and AD module also Active Directory module also brings you AD drive as well. So now I have that session created. If we look at the session configuration, you can see that configuration name is demo.ad-helpdesk on domain controller. And I want to show you again this command add-on. So, oh, that's the old one. I still haven't connected. This is a bug actually, unfortunately. This is how it looks like when you are connected. I expected this to get the local ones and then to get update once when I'm connected. So this is kind of a remote GUI that will give you access to commands inside of your constrained GIA endpoint. Then you can see here that I have a bunch of those required ones, and then I have reset user password, unlock AD account, and get user info. So you can work directly from here and run it, and it will run and show you that I'm connected as test /non-admin user, but I'm executing this as run as user with the name virtual WinRM, WinRM virtual users WinRM VA2 test non-admin. As you can see, the name is a little bit strange, but actually when you look at it, you get information about connected user as well. So test_non-admin is the connected one. So just looking at the name of that virtual account, you will see who is also connected running that. So this is kind of a GUI provided for connecting to those remote sessions. If you run you close this one, you run get command directly here, you see that I have those 8 required ones. The reset user password is coming from my module that I've created. The unlock account is coming from Active Directory, and get user info is defined in that role capability file. You can also run it directly here, same output, or from that GUI, and that's it. So this is how it works when you test and look at the GIA endpoint. You get really controlled a subset of capabilities. Everything runs nicely, so we executed as a known admin all those functions on domain controller without exposing domain controller to the non-admin user, so he cannot exploit it. There's one more thing that I want to show you. I will now connect as a domain admin to domain controller and show you how one of those transcript files looks like. So you can see here, if I go to transcripts folder, I have all those transcripts filed here, created during my testing of GIA feature and stuff. And I will again use that great capability of PS Edit to work with remote files to get that into a local session. And when we look here, you can see that, there's a lot of things here. You see information when the session started, who is the username of connected user, run as user, machine, host, process, all that stuff. And then you get a bunch of information about the commands that are actually executed in that endpoint. So we have lots of lines of transcript. I didn't even run it for a long time, but it created like almost 6,000 lines of logging. So you can go through all that and see what's happening with your endpoint. which is really great. You can automate all that. You can transfer those transcript files to some network share central kind of thing, and then have some nice queries to go through that and fetch information and stuff. And you will be in control of what's happening with PowerShell remoting in your environment. There's also one more thing that I want to show to you, and unfortunately it doesn't work in remote sessions, so you need to execute that locally. PowerShell team is aware of that, and they are working on fixing that bug. There is a new commandlet called get PS session capability that will actually tell you what are the capabilities of a certain user account, targeting a certain configuration name on a machine. So if I copy this and go to my domain controller here, and I run this, you can see that test non-admin user is able to run this set of commands. But if I connect as a demo user, which is my domain admin, to a same, he doesn't have access to get user info, to unlock user AD account, to reset user password. So he has less rights actually than the non-admin user here, right? This is how GIA works, and they define the role for it. And for this admin, domain admin, you only get those required ones, but nothing else than that, because we didn't expose those functions for that guy. If we assign it to a user group and I add some users to that group, all the members of that group will have the same access to the same subset of functions. So I hope that they will fix this, and it will also work remotely so that we can check who is able to do what. And that will be all for me for this Just Enough administration session. If you have some questions. Yes. Okay. Absolutely. So it's your job then to create a GUI that will actually expose GIA through a GUI to your help desk engineering team. So then when they use a GUI to connect to a domain controller, they will get from a GUI a short form that they can fill out with a username and then reset the password. So one of the examples how that works is here with this command add-on in ISC, where actually you can think about it as some kind of a small GUI that gives you access to a GIA endpoint. But you need to do that by yourself if you want it outside of ISC. Okay. So if that's all, thank you for attending this second session today. The next one is Klaus with Azure Functions, and we will talk about that after lunch in about an hour.